do a real quick intro for you in case we've got people joining us for the first time. And that way, it'll be a nice refresher for those that were here the last time. So when is a good, is it almost?
Yeah, I would say it's 12:35. We can go ahead and start
Okay,
that way, and then anyone who comes in can just jump along.
okay, very good. All right, everybody, welcome to Lunch and Learn Entrepreneur Speaker Series. This is the right strategy. Business plan, building a business plan, session number 2. So if you missed last week's session, I am already working on editing that video, and then I'll be sharing with all of the guests that attended in person and virtually on Zoom. Thank you so much for the Zoom folks and for being so patient with us. And thank you everybody here. If you do not already know, this is Brandon Melchor. Brandon is working as the Integrated Academic Support Specialist, a shared position between the Writing Center and the College of Business, colloquially known as a communications coach. His stated mission is to establish a space for RCV Kobe students to feel comfortable engaging more deeply with writing and gain lifelong communication skills. He has partnered with RCV Kobe faculty and other staff to pilot a range of writing workshops such as this one and other support initiatives for students. When we send you the feedback survey after today, it's really important that you, in the comments, specify whether you want another similar series with Brandon's assistance. We can change it up just a tad, and I'm sure Brandon can help accommodate the engagement topics. All right, Brandon, well, without further ado, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. Much like last session, there's a lot of information to go over, so we're just gonna dive on into it. So we'll go ahead and start with an overview. So this workshop, it's a bit of a sister workshop with the last one. So in this one, the goal is to prepare you guys to make critical and rhetorical decisions when you're in the writing process. By rhetorical, I mean mostly, let's see how to describe it well. When I say rhetorical decisions, right, you might have heard of like the study of rhetoric, right? Maybe you don't have a lot of great associations with it. But in the context of this business plan, a rhetorical decision just means something that is convincing, something that is impactful, something that leaves a strong impression, right? Something that answers a question that the audience may have had, right, before they can even ask it, stuff like that. We will also be spending some time looking at some examples, evaluating them and their effectiveness. What works well, maybe what doesn't work, maybe something can be changed, tweaked, all those different things. There's gonna be 4 major sections. We're gonna go over genre first, right? We're gonna delve a little bit more into the shape of the business plan, right? And then we'll be talking about audience expectations, right? How to meet them and how to exceed them, right? Because when you think about your audience in the right way, you can sort of really get inside their heads. And then we'll also be talking about purpose, right? So the process of how purpose interacts with the process of shaping the business plan. And then at the very end, I will be addressing editing, because again, I think it is something that a lot of people get caught up on, right? Maybe they don't think about editing in the right way, or there's better ways to think about editing. So I'll also be sharing some strategies and some concepts for that. So let's see. Okay, we're going to do the first activity. So I've explained the 3 things I'm going to be going over: audience, purpose, and genre. So for you, right, if you're writing a business plan, which element do you think is most important? And then you can go ahead and rank them.
Can we see that?
Yeah, those should be right there.
So we go to
Menti.com and then just enter that 8-digit code,
Menti.
and then you should be able to, the activity should pop right up. 7 years old. We'll give it 1 second. So I think these are some interesting results. If I were to talk about, when I talk about these 3 elements, for me, I think all of them are essentially equally important. They're all sort of interconnected. You can't really have one without the other, right? And so as we go through it, I just thought it would be interesting to see sort of your guys' priorities, right? Business plans. Hello. Should absolutely be written for the audience, right? They should be sort of that like big part of your mind. So yeah, and it's interesting to see what you guys prioritize. Sure. So we're beginning with the shape of the business plan, right? Sort of what a business plan looks like. And within that sort of idea of a genre, right, which is something we talked about last time, where there is room for creativity, right? And sort of breaking and bending those rules. So something to remember is that learning a genre is a process, right? So when I'm talking about genre, of course, I mean the business plan, right? Business plans are that genre that we're focused on. And genres are social creations, right? When you say business plan, right, it triggers a lot of thoughts and ideas in people, and we are the ones who determine like what a business plan is, right? It can be a little bit hard to define it, right? You can talk about different elements, what goes in it. It's one of those, I know when I see it, right? And so when we're talking about business plans, they can be unique along many, many different axes, right? So when you're looking at a business plan, it can be different depending on the industry, right? The company, the department, and even the individual, right? So depending on what you're focusing on and who you're focusing on, the expectations sort of change, right? I think the big one here is specifically industry, right? A business plan for, let's say, a coffee shop, which is the example we'll be looking at, would be different from one that would be like a consulting service or something in a different industry. So it's important to sort of know that broader context in which you are writing. And there is a lot of gray area, right? A lot of general guidelines, but not a lot of specific answers. So sort of navigating this area and trying to make those critical decisions, right? Especially with such high stakes, right? Because you're looking for money, you're looking for investment. That can be really intimidating. But it's also important to remember that this sort of gray area, this sort of flexibility in what genre is, means there's room for creativity and room for flexibility, right? Room to make decisions that help you stand out and be more convincing. And the best way to improve your writing, if you're looking to improve it, is to make sure you're reading critically, right? So when you're looking at business plan examples, like we will be doing, not just reading it and not just looking at like what it is, but the decisions that are being made by the writer, by the author, right? Looking at the kinds of numbers they're including and thinking about, well, why are they doing that, right? That's that sort of, there's a lot of critical thought and analysis that goes into sort of evaluating different examples and different resources if you're looking to draw from them. And it's important to do it with style, of course, appropriate style, right? There are limits to like what can be expected, right? And I would say the key thing is show, don't tell. And we can go into that more when we get to the examples, right? Evidence, numbers, figures, stuff like that, forecasting, right? The more specifics you use, the more you show how the business will succeed, less than tell it. And also tell a story, right? Each of these, as you go through this business plan, right? This isn't just like a list of things, right? There is a story to be told, right? A story about your business. There's limits on how you can tell it and what you can say, but there is still that room to tell a story. And again, we'll go through some specific examples that sort of show that storytelling. And if you are thinking of breaking or bending those conventions, Make sure you're aware of them first, right, confident, and only do it if it makes it more appealing or convincing. So this is the Live Plan Coffee Shop's table of contents, and I think starting here is a really good way of understanding what I mean when I say shape. So last time we talked about like the major sections, and if you look at this table of contents, you can see those major sections, right? The executive summary, company summary, product, market analysis, strategic and implementation, management, financial plan, appendix. But then, so overall, you can see that like shape of a business plan, right? You see number, or you see terms and a structure that you can expect if you're familiar with the business plan. But within this structure, in the smaller details is where it's more flexible, right? Looking at some of the other specific things, one thing I would like to highlight is in the management summary, when it talks about the management team, it also says management team gaps, right? And that is a rhetorical decision, right? To talk about the gaps in your management, right? Maybe it's not, it's the impression it sets might not be the best, right? Like if you're acknowledging gaps in your management, that might leave a negative association on its surface, right? Like, oh, so there's gaps in your team management. But then later on, if we look at it, if you address that concern that's been brought up, well, then now it's even more effective, right? Because you've sort of acknowledged that shortcoming, but also talking about how you're going to overcome it, right? And so those are the kinds of critical decisions where on the surface, maybe it doesn't seem like the best choice, but when you interrogate it, when you look at those details, you can see that it actually makes it the piece of writing stronger. It makes the business plan more convincing. So yeah, you can see here, it's just the shape sort of bends and curves depending on what the author wants, right? Like it has those major sections, but within those major sections, right, there's room for this information to be possibly rearranged, right? And sort of edited, taken out, added more to, right? Let's see. You can also see there's a lot of tables and charts, right? A lot of numbers and figures. So that's another thing, right? In terms of like what is going to be unique to your business, right? So all of these tables and numbers and figures are your opportunity to show and not tell. So here we have the executive summary, and I want to highlight it because I think it also has a really interesting rhetorical decision. I'm going to go ahead and read out that little first section so that we can all hear it. So Java Culture Company Bar is determined to become a daily necessity for local coffee addicts, a place to dream of as you try to escape the daily stresses of life, and just a comfortable place to meet your friends or to read a book all in one. With growing demand for high quality gourmet coffee and great service, Java Culture will capitalize on its proximity to the University of Oregon campus to build a core group of repeat customers. Java Culture will offer its customers the best prepared coffee in the area that will be complemented with pastries as well as free books that its patrons can read to enjoy their visit. So again, to sort of go back around to the previous session, in a business plan, it really should be, or traditionally it should be written in that third person perspective, right? You should avoid the use of I or you, but you can see here from the very beginning, at the very early part of that, they've decided to break that convention, right? I would say this little first sentence especially, right? Dream of as you try to escape, right? It's very much written more in the tone of something you would see in marketing, right? Like a social media post or something like that. So of course, depending on the audience, right? Some people might react to that well, some might not. But that is what I mean when I say like a rhetorical choice, right? Something that again, on the surface, it's something that can be sort of judged and evaluated, right? And then whether or not it is effective sort of depends on a lot of various factors, of which we will also delve into later. But also, you can see that there's a lot of very specific details. It's already from the jump telling the audience exactly where the business is going to be based, and it's also sort of setting up a lot of again, questions that the audience already has, right? Like the consumer base, where it's going to be located, all those really important nitty-gritty details, it's already sort of answering those initial concerns, right? So then that's really what you need in order to build up that credibility, right? So you can say that this is a very credible executive summary in that it is very, very specific, right? If you look at more at the rest of it, I won't read it, but you can see it's talking about the space, it's talking about like exactly how much they've raised already, right, from investment, and how much they're planning on getting from loans, how much they're planning on growing, right, how much profit they're planning on making. So these sort of elements are interwoven, right? And so, yeah, it's just very rhetorical, I would say, right? Rhetorically strong in that it provides a lot of specifics. And then maybe if you're the type of person who doesn't really like that first person or second person perspective, it's a little rhetorically weak in that opening, right? But it just depends on the people's different priorities. We'll move right down next to the next section, talking about the objectives, key to success, and mission. One thing that I will point out, one little criticism I had when I was looking through it, is in the keys to success, right? It talks about that the store design will be both visually attractive to customers and designed for fast and efficient operations. That's not a bad thing to say, right? Obviously. But the problem is, again, it's that sort of show, don't tell, right? At this point, you can say that you're going to have good design, but can I, as an audience member, believe you, right? This is very early on in the business plan. Some credibility has been built up, but then it leaves that question, right? Like, is there, how can I know as an outsider, right? Because I can, see a lot of those inner machinations of your plan, right? Like you can envision how it's going to look, but I can't because I'm from the outside. And so one thing that you could do, right, if you sort of wanted to address this possible concern, and the reason I call it a criticism is because this business plan doesn't, but I would say in the appendices, including some kind of multimodal element, right? Like just a floor, even if it's just something simple as like a drawing, right? Like a floor plan or something like that, then you're sort of addressing that concern, right? It shows that understanding that the audience can't see inside your head, right? And then also it adds more credibility as well. So yeah, it's just one of those things where if you're going to say it, then you should also back it up with something. And we're living in a world where increasingly, like we have like Canva and other programs, right? So the sort of bar is being raised as far as like design capabilities, right? So if you happen to be good with Canva or maybe even just a hand drawing, having something that sort of shows that floor plan would be a really good way of following up, right? You have that set up, and then later on in the business plan, it's addressed. And then that shows and that builds even more credibility. Okay, so now we're gonna go a bit more into audience, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and ask a question. So looking at everything that we've, look at the examples we have so far, who is the audience for this business plan? And everyone has multiple, I believe up to 3 responses, so you can even type multiple responses depending on how you think. Give it one more second for anyone to come up with any last second ideas.
Yeah.
So we can see here, the sort of typical, right, group, right? So there's like, partners, right, possible business partners, people who either are already on board, right? Or maybe even you're looking for an additional business partner. If you're looking for investors, right? And what I really like is the mention of angel investors. So there's also different kind of investors, right? So there's like angel investors, there's venture capital funds, right? There's all these different kinds of, so when we're talking about those labels and audiences, there's also labels within, right? So, customers doesn't really apply here. Typically, you don't write a business plan for customers, right? It's sort of something you want to keep, to yourself, right? Only show to absolutely, absolutely people you have to. But yeah, banks as well, right? For loans and other kinds of money, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when we're talking about that audience and writer relationship, it's centered mostly around that transaction, right? Whether it's investment, whether it's joining you or lending you money, right? It's ultimately about that transaction. And so the key thing to getting into that mindset where you understand the audience is asking yourself the right questions, right? So beyond knowing just who we're writing for, we also need to be aware of what they think and what they want, right? So one thing that your audience will always be doing is questioning you, right? Especially in something like a business plan where there is these sort of high stakes, right? The audience will always be asking deeper questions. And so you need to sort of be anticipating those questions, right? So what does the audience need to see? What do they want to see? And what can you do to meet those needs, right? And then when you're making specific choices, right? If you're including a point, an argument, or evidence, right? Thinking about what's making it effective. Is this the best place to include this figure or include this chart, right? Is this the best place to talk about this in detail, or should I be only introducing concepts for later reference, right? Like in that executive summary, they sort of mentioned a lot of things, but not in detail, because that's not what you would do in an executive summary, right? It's sort of an overview so that the audience has that sort of initial, that initial impression, right? And it's also sort of a hook. So you're looking to catch them. So you also wouldn't want to overwhelm them with too many figures, right? And then you're also telling a story, right? Yes.
I feel that sometimes when you're writing an executive summary, you can then feel like you're being repetitive, but it's not that you're being repetitive. It's just like what you said, you're giving them an introduction and you're offering them an enticement, but then you'll elaborate further when it comes time.
Yeah, absolutely. And also because business plans are generally written in that third person objective way, they tend to be very dry documents, right? There can be that like repetitive feeling. And so to jump back to genre based on your sort of question, that is a reason why you might break that convention, right? You might use you or I or we because you think maybe you've used the name of your business a little too much, or because it has that wrinkle where you're sort of closing the distance between the audience, right? Because when you say I or you acknowledge that relationship. So then that closeness, it can feel fresh, it can feel new, it can feel like, well, the way this person thinks is a little bit different, right? It's not just like plain and dry, right? Sometimes people need, especially in very long, very complicated documents, little things to spice it up to make it interesting. And then also, let's see, I had another point, but it's already slipped my mind.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I believe, let's see, third person. Yeah, we'll go ahead and move forward. Maybe it'll come back to me. So another thing to keep in mind is the idea of intended and unintended audience. Most people, when they're writing, envision the audience as a single person, right? So you're thinking of that one investor or that one bank, right, that you're looking for the money from. But oftentimes your audience will include all of them, right? Because there's the one person or that one group of people that you intend, but you can never fully predict who's going to see it, right? Maybe you meet someone who is interested in joining, right, your business, right? They want to join on as a partner, but they want to see your business plan first, right? So then, one thing that might be useful to keep in mind is the fact that, sort of that unpredictability, that you never know exactly everyone who's going to see your business plan, right? So then keeping in mind those different kinds of audiences as you're writing sort of lends more flexibility to that document, right? You can show it to more people without having to go back and change things or edit it. Some examples of intended audience, just as another broader overview, right? If you're a student, then you're thinking your professor. And then also if you're like applying to like scholarships or internships and stuff like that, there's like hiring and grant committees. When we're talking even more broadly, right, about books, right? There's like young adult audiences, right? So, and then if you're posting to social media, you have like your friends and your followers. And then if you're posting, or if you're like publishing academically, it's like your fellow researchers in the field, right? And then if you want to think about unintended audience, it would be like, for example, your fellow classmates, right? Maybe you're writing your paper primarily for your professor, but you also know that your classmates might also read it if you happen to be giving feedback or something like that. Also like coworkers, secondary demographics, right? Like when something is published, there is that intended market, right? But there's also a lot of unintended market. So it's also spending time thinking about that. And then of course, if you're like posting to social media, then you're posting publicly where everyone can see it, right? So there's always a sort of broader, more complicated audience than what we might originally think. So it's just important to remember that intended equals imagined, right? It's who you think of when you're writing, but unintended does not mean unimagined, right? It's oftentimes very, very important to have people who you don't intend to invest in you, right? Look at it, right? Whether that's family, friends, colleagues, right? If they happen to catch something that is confusing or doesn't make sense or maybe isn't convincing, then more than likely your intended audience will share in that confusion, right? So then the more eyes you have on your paper, the more you sort of or the more like questions and concerns get caught and then answered before you even show it to your intended audience. It's definitely useful to get multiple eyes on your writing if you can. So again, for example, talking about like audience expectations, we have this little piece of market analysis, and I'm using this more as like a bit of a metaphorical device, right? So we have like the list of potential customers for this business plan. Obviously, it's going to be mostly students and faculty because they're targeting like a specific university. But then there's also teenagers, office workers, and also like other people in the area. So this is also sort of the way that you should think about it, right? That it should be sort of multi-dimensional. So you have like your initial intended audience and then other unintended audiences, and then making sure you're apportioning your effort and your time and your thought to this, right? In this sort of same model, where if you were a business, you would have your target market that you would primarily focus on, and then you would also spend time thinking about those unintended markets. It's the same thing with the business plan. So you have your intended audience, the people you're planning on showing it to, but then also making sure you're putting in that little effort to address things that might not be for that initial audience. Do we have any questions so far? Everyone keeping up? Good. So now we'll be moving on to purpose, right? So sort of like I was getting at before, the key to sort of thinking about your purpose is layering your approach, right? Especially in writing, you have this broad goal, right, of getting investment, but there's a lot of smaller goals that you need to meet. For example, each section of the business plan also has its own purpose, right? And so there are these sort of smaller purposes mixed in the broader purpose of creating a business plan. But all of these little purposes, whether they're big, whether they're small, whether they are primary or secondary, they're all interconnected. So they all sort of need some apportionment of time and effort. And so we're talking about, time management, right? It's thinking about what is most important and what isn't, right? So it's just sort of having that layered approach and making sure you're keeping your priorities straight, right? And you can do that by taking this approach, right? Like when you're thinking about purpose, also keeping in mind the genre, right? The expectations, and then the audience, right? I know it can sound kind of cyclical at times, but that's because it is, right? You sort of can't talk or think about one of these without talking or thinking about the other. All right, so in your own words, state the purpose of a business plan. What you think your purpose would be if you were to write a business plan. What really makes this discussion interesting, and also kind of messy, is just the fact that none of these purposes are wrong, right? Depending on how you think of business plans, each and every one of these is correct, right? To demonstrate an idea of what the goals are of my venture and the ways that I plan to achieve those goals, to show all of the aspects of your business, to convince the audience that my business is viable by explaining who we are, where we've been, and where we want to go, right? To convey the business idea, current position, financial status, financial needs, and strategic plan for accomplishment. I think personally, this is the thing that makes writing really beautiful, is that everyone sort of has their own way of thinking, right? And you can talk all day about like the different, I could talk all day about the different sort of purposes of a business plan, but ultimately you yourself have to make that decision of what it means to you. And I just think it's really fascinating seeing the different ways people think about something that like this very intensive, very important kind of writing. But yeah, my business plan is a roadmap detailing business goals and metrics and how you will achieve them, right? For some people, it's a little more personal, more focused on yourself. For others, they tend to think of the audience first, right? And some people think about informing versus convincing, right? And none of these elements are wrong, right? None of these statements are incorrect. It just shows the different priorities that we all have. So some more examples on priorities, right? In the executive summary, right? I didn't get to go into it too much, but it talks about how they plan on establishing this coffee business in Oregon, right? And here it talks about how US coffee consumption has seen steady growth, with gourmet coffee having the strongest growth. Coffee drinkers in the Pacific Northwest are among the most demanding ones. They favor well-brewed gourmet coffee drinks and demand great service. Eugene, Oregon, with its liberal and outgoing populace and long rainy winter, has traditionally been a great place for coffee establishments. Java Culture will strive to build a loyal customer base by offering a great tasting coffee in a relaxing environment of its coffee bar, located close to the bustling University of Oregon campus. So you can see there, again, it's got a lot of specifics. And then in terms of storytelling, there is a bit of a story there, right? You can sort of envision the environment, right? When they talk about strong coffee, right? You're thinking about, or good coffee, when they're talking about the weather, right? But then also, if I'm an audience member, if I am a possible investor, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, how are you going to stand out, right? If coffee is such a big industry, yes, it's growing, but how are you specifically, how is your business going to succeed? How are you going to sort of plant your flag and grow and stuff like that? As they go through, right, that question has been set up, and then they immediately sort of start addressing it, right? When it starts talking about that market segmentation, so they are showing like specifically who they're targeting and how they're gonna target them. Again, we don't really have the time to go through each and every piece, but I just think this is a really interesting rhetorical decision, right? It's sort of setting up questions and then immediately answering them, immediately addressing them, and sort of showing that it is well thought out, right? They're not just starting a business here because it's sort of setting up that it's not just because Oregon is like, there's a lot of growth and it's a big coffee, right? They're sort of establishing that sort of, like a lot of small business owners do, that sort of homegrown vibe, right? That they're not just here to make money, right? Making money is a part of it, but when you sort of include these elements where you're talking about the population and the environment, right? You're sort of establishing that tone of that sort of, how do I put it?
Their identity.
Yeah, that tone of identity, right? They're establishing that they're thinking more than just about the money, right? Because as important as that is, it's not everything, right? So then it's about how you think your audience will react, right? If you're taking this to a bank, well, maybe they don't really care about the environment, right? So that doesn't really matter to them. But if you're also, this is getting shown to a possible business partner, someone who lives in the area, right? Someone who knows the area, well, then it adds more credibility to you, because then it shows that you care about the place you're in and not just, here for the money. So that's another thing where there's all this intersection between like when you make choices, how it affects different people in different ways. Yeah. So of course, something I talked on before, there is this sort of interchanging relationship between you, the writer, and your audience. For example, if your professor assigns you a reading and has you write a paper, right, their goal is to sort of see that you can understand and you can explain and you can apply the course material, right? They're not the professor typically isn't having you write an essay because they hate you and they want you to suffer, right? There is that sort of purpose that they have as an audience member. And so when since your goal as the writer is to sort of inform and convince, right? The audience's purpose is to be informed and to be convinced, right? Like when you go writing, it's about that you sort of assume the audience will put in that good faith effort to read and evaluate what you're writing. And so since you working from the assumption of that good faith, you also have to act in that good faith. So there's this sort of give and take and push and pull with the audience at all times, right? So if your goal is to inform, right, the audience wants to learn. If your goal is to persuade, well, then the audience wants to be convinced. And if your goal is to explain, then the audience sort of wants to see you make those connections, right? They want to sort of see how you are putting this together. And that carries over to the business plan, right? That sort of audience purpose is also something you should keep in mind, and it should inform your decisions when you're sort of writing through this. Another example is the strategic implementation and summary, right? So here they also continue to address, right? There's sort of multiple things going on here, right? We have that sort of competitive edge and sales strategy, right? But previously they had set up that question of like, how are you going to succeed, right? How are you going to sort of plant your flag, sort of find your niche, right? And so then later on in the paper, as they talk more specifics, right? Java Culture will position itself as a unique coffee bar where its patrons can not only enjoy a cup of perfectly brewed coffee, but also spend their time in an ambient environment. Comfortable sofas and chairs, dimmed light, and quiet, relaxing music will help the customers relax from the daily stresses and will differentiate Java Culture from incumbent competitors. So they're acknowledging the fact that, you know, there's a lot of competition and probably a lot of them have been around for a while, right? They're more established. So they're talking about sort of the things they're doing. And again, there's that painting a picture, storytelling. At this point, maybe they don't have that. They don't have the floor plan, right? But at the very least, they are addressing it in some way. They're giving some vision of the coffee shop. So yes, and then there's a lot of more nitty-gritty details that, again, we don't have time to really dig into. But one thing that you can see, if you look through this business plan and if you look through a lot of others, is there's sort of the storytelling, and it's always followed by figures and numbers, right? And you'll never find too much of one or the other, right? It sort of goes back and forth and interplays because, again, when we're keeping audience in mind, we don't want to fatigue them either, right? There is a lot of information to go over, a lot of numbers to show, a lot of details to address. And so, again, to circle it back around, that's also the larger reason why this genre exists, right? Because when we're talking about business communication, it's efficient and it is structured, right? So the reason business plan exists is because it's hard to sort of find the initial, right? Like you can never really, or it's difficult to talk about like when it came into existence, right? Like when business plans became a thing, right? It's always kind of fuzzy, but there's these broader sort of reasons that they exist, right? And so business plans exist because it is sort of the most efficient way that we have at this moment, right? And then as that genre grows and changes, it's because the more effective things are found, right? So there's this sort of, when we're talking about audience, purpose, genre, like anthropologically, right? There's these sort of broader reasons and contexts. And so it's just important to keep in mind that the way it's good to, the reason we have genre and the reason it's important to follow these is because people smarter than me and maybe smarter than you have figured this stuff out, right? So it's about efficiency, it's about presentation, right? Because the audience knows what a business plan is, they sort of have those expectations, then it makes it easier to digest all of this information and all of these numbers, right? It's comfortable, it's understandable. There's that language of business plans, not just in the literal word choices, but in the structure and the format and the organization. And these things are all sort of interconnected and all sort of play on each other. So yeah, lots of numbers, lots of figures, but not just that, and not how to put it, not just numbers and figures, right, a story, but not too much story either, right, not too much, right, in all of the examples we've looked at, there was that one wrinkle where they used you, and then everything else is straight up third person, right, so it's those rhetorical choices that can make your sort of business plan unique and powerful, but then if there's too many wrinkles, too many folds, then the structure starts to fall apart. So it's thinking about the overall shape and then how you can make that shape unique. Does that make sense?
Yes, I like the way that you mentioned earlier, you said the business plan storytelling always followed by figures and numbers.
Yeah.
So that's very important to know and understand because we can't rely on one too heavily without also providing you the other. Has to be a balance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's a really interesting conversation because there is a balance, but even within that balance, there's multiple ways to strike it as well, right? Like something can be well structured, but still look completely different than, like one business plan can be well structured and still look completely different. So it's that sort of process, that's why I use the term shaping, right? It's as you're going along, as you're building it, thinking about specific details, but then also the broader sort of how you think it's going to look in the end. But yeah. Another thing I would stress is that business plans are living documents, right? Technically, all writing is living, right? There's no such thing as dead writing. It's always supposed to, so it's sort of something that you always remain flexible on, right? As a business plan is supposed to sort of be this document that you refer back to, right? It is a plan. As you gain more experience as a business person, maybe one thing you thought now will change, right? Maybe a strategy or a certain aspect of it just isn't what you thought it was going to be. So then it might be worth going back and changing it, right? It's one of those things where, again, thinking about like the structure of the organization, you don't want to go back and pick away too much and then everything fall apart. But it is something that is, yeah, it's living, right? It should always, there's sort of always the opportunity for change and for growth, even within a piece of writing. So not everyone's favorite part, editing. I know that editing is something that can be very, very, I think it causes a lot of headaches for people, and actually, well, I want to see your guys' opinion on it first. So 3 statements, right? And then how much do you agree with that statement? On a scale from 0 or 1 to 5. Okay, good. It seems like you guys don't have too much issues with editing. It seems like everyone recognizes it's important, and because you recognize it's important, you put in the effort to sort of be good at it, right? And then it's always a little bit stressful, right? It's kind of unavoidable. But I want to talk a bit about how we think about editing and then sort of hopefully changing your mind about it too. So we'll start with, these are just, and again, I won't go in detail because nobody's super enjoyed like nitty gritty details like these, right? It's not exactly fun. But these are just 20 of the most common grammatical errors, right? I don't think it's too surprising for anyone. Pronoun confusion, comma splices, like incomplete sentences. And I think what most often leads to these kinds of errors is the way we think about it, right? The sort of assumptions we have built up around grammar and punctuation. So this is these are the sort of building blocks for how I think, most people sort of think about punctuation and grammar. Maybe you don't agree with all of it. But it is sort of what we're taught in like that middle school to high school area, right? The idea that punctuation is inert, that the rules are never gonna change, right? You know where a period goes, you know where a comma goes, and that's never gonna change. And that punctuation's biggest job is just ending sentences, right? Period, exclamation mark, question mark, like it mostly just ends sentences, right? And then some sentences, who knows why, have punctuation inside, especially commas, right? And that mostly punctuation just tells the reader when to stop and like when to slow down and all of that. But it's not that these assumptions are necessarily wrong, right? Punctuation is functional and mechanical, but it is also rhetorical, right? When we are making editing decisions, right? Your focus shouldn't be on what is just technically correct. It should be on what is convincing, right? Let me get a little bit more forward and then I can talk about it. So sentence structure, right? The best thing I can tell you is that variance is key, right? We have simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, right? Another thing where we all sort of know those terms, we know vaguely why, like that they exist, maybe not why, right? So simple sentences are supposed to be for simple statements and concepts, right? It's direct, it's punchy, it's straightforward. If it's simple sentence, simple sentence, simple sentence, simple sentence, then there's like stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. Compound sentences are used for mixing simple and concept statements and yes, they tend to be a little more measured and controlled, right? If you include more complex sentences, right, then it isn't so much stop and go and stop and go. It sort of flows a little more naturally, right? In student academic writing, the idea is to be just a little more conversational, right? The way it flows is it should flow like a conversation, right? It should read the way someone would say it. So for something like this, that doesn't apply too closely. I would say it's more like a presentation, right? Like if there's still that professional element, it is still like measured, correct, planned, but it's natural, right? It's easier to follow. And then if you have too many complex sentences, right? You tend to see this a lot in academic writing, and I would describe it perhaps controversially as long-winded, right? If you have lots and lots of complex sentences, then the audience will get fatigued, right? It's almost like if, for example, someone stood up here for an hour and just talked to you the whole time, right? Maybe towards the end, you sort of start waning in focus, right? There's no chance to stop and to breathe. And so when I say like punctuation and sentence structure is rhetorical, that's what I mean. It means when you're writing, thinking what impact is it going to have on my audience, right? How are they gonna read this? Am I using too many long sentences, right? Can this be broken up, made a little more simple, a little easier to understand? And again, the key is variance, and I think the next example shows that really, really well. So this is the company summary, right? And so you can see, again, talking about genre, the reason things are broken up is because it makes it easier for the audience to digest, right? The titles tell you exactly like what the content of the paragraphs are, right? You could read it and figure out what they're trying to say, but it's much easier if you're looking through it it tells you exactly what it is, the company summary, company owner, and then startup summary. And then another thing you might notice in a lot of business plan is there's paragraphs, but then there's also bullet points, right? All of this information is broken up and simplified to the best way it could be, right? From the startup summary, this could just be one huge paragraph, right? Or multiple huge paragraphs, but that makes it so much harder to digest, right? The bullet points make it easier for the audience to scan line by line. And it's not even technically grammatically correct in some places, right? It's just espresso machine, $6,000, coffee maker, $900, right? So it's, even though it's not technically grammatically correct, it is rhetorical, right? Because it's a decision that benefits the audience, right? And that's sort of what I'm getting at, right? And if you look through, you can see, you know, complex sentences and stuff like that, like it's talking about the ownership, right? Ownership sometimes is a little complicated, right? It's usually not just one person, there's percentages and stuff like that. And so the explanation also has to be a little bit complicated, but that's to be expected, right? Your audience knows that, and so they will accept a more complicated kind of explanation. But then for certain things, like if you're just listing off the cost, like it doesn't need to be overly complicated. If each and every one of these points was a full sentence, fully grammatically correct, even if they were simple, it would just be way too much. So sometimes, even if it's not technically correct, simplifying benefits the audience. And so it's about, you know, these sort of interconnected thoughts and ideas. Here are some of my sources. And do we have any questions? Those of you on Zoom can also put it up on the screen for everyone to see, and I'll go ahead and take these last minutes to just answer questions that anybody has. Everyone can take a breath. I know it was a lot of information.
What about graphs? Like, what about adding graphs? What do you think about that in the business plan?
Yeah, so.
Or tables?
Yeah, graphs and tables, like I said, like in the business plan example we looked at, there was lots of graphs and tables. Just make sure they look clean, right? You know, how much you end up including is sort of a choice that you will have to make. But if I had to give guidelines, make sure they're clean, make sure they're professional, make sure they look good, right? If it doesn't look good, if it looks kind of just like random clip art that you got, then it's not going to be good, right? Then there is a visual language to multimodal elements, right? If you're including graphs and you're including charts, just make sure they're easy to understand and they're pleasing to the eye. Yes. Did you have a question? Oh, great presentation. Thank you so much. I think I can thumbs up that. No, I.
That's so cool. I like that we can give feedback on there.
Yes.
Yes.
I saw Kanea liking all the editing comments.
He was like, I know we all don't love editing. I was like, I love editing. I love editing. That's my thing.
That's so cool.
I like that you suggested that we could break up the business plan, especially with the financials, as bulleted items versus
Mhm.
simple sentences or complex sentences, because yeah, they can become long-winded and it's hard to read everything and consider all of their expenses and make sure that we understand what that business is trying to convey. And so I think that tip that, you know, making sure that you can sort of just in a very simple way, bullet out your expenses, that saves you so much time. And it also is very complimentary for the reader.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and answer this question to the best of my ability. One thing that I talked a lot about in the last presentation was the difference between academic writing and business writing. So in academic writing, right, like if you're writing an essay, your professor will give you a page count and then you're kind of just, you know, Like maybe you're just like, I'm not at the full page count, so I'm just gonna like add some random stuff so that I get to the page count. The business writing is less about the number of pages that you hit, right? So I would say, if you're trying to get a sense for what might be, like the appropriate length, is just as long as you are hitting those major sections, then it shouldn't end up too long, right? So it's not so much about reaching a certain page count, it's more about like making sure you're including the right content. So if that takes longer than maybe you think it should have, well then that just might be how it is. Or maybe you can just trim some information down, right? It's one of those things where you have to kill your darlings. So if you are showing this to other people, right? And they are getting fatigued and they are getting confused, or then maybe your business plan is too long. But again, that always goes back to the impact it has on the audience. So you by yourself, it's kind of hard to get a sense, but if you you've sort of lost your way, right? Then relying on other people's perspectives can be a good way at sort of heading back in the right direction. But it's just not about page count. It's not about hitting a specific number. It's about making sure you are convincing and sharing all the information you need to and stuff like that. So in sort of the same way that you shouldn't be thinking about what's technically correct, you should be thinking about reaching a specific page count.
Oh, I don't know what's in the chat.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Love it.
Okay, well, if we don't, do we have any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you so much, Zoom folks, and a round of applause for Brandon. And I will be sending out the evaluation after, and you know, I'll send it to everybody's emails because I didn't create a QR code for it. But for those of us that joined in the Zoom, we'll also be sharing that. Here we go. We'll also be sharing that.
All this.
I'm on here twice.
You can stop recording.
Can I start recording here?
Yes, you go, well, actually, no, I think you're gonna.
I have to go to my office.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have to go to my office. Okay, well, I'm gonna leave here and then I'll go close out over there. But thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.